Chapter 28 of Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jimmy and Jamie. Pollyanna was not the only one that was finding the winter a hard one. In Boston, Jimmy Pendleton, in spite of his strenuous efforts to occupy his time and thoughts, was discovering that nothing quite erased from his vision a certain pair of laughing blue eyes, and nothing quite obliterated from his memory a certain well-loved, merry voice. Jimmy told himself that if it were not for Mrs. Carew and the fact that he could be of some use to her, life would not be worth living. Even at Mrs. Carew's it was not all joy, for always there was Jamie, and Jamie brought thoughts of Pollyanna, unhappy thoughts. Being thoroughly convinced that Jamie and Pollyanna cared for each other, and also being equally convinced that he himself was honor-bound to step one side and give the handicapped Jamie full right of way, it never occurred to him to question further. Of Pollyanna, he did not like to talk or to hear. He knew that both Jamie and Mrs. Carew heard from her, and when they spoke of her, he forced himself to listen, in spite of his heartache. But he always changed the subject as soon as possible, and he limited his own letters to her to the briefest and most infrequent epistles possible. For, to Jimmy, a Pollyanna that was not his was nothing but a source of pain and wretchedness, and he had been so glad when the time came for him to leave Beldingsville and take up his studies again in Boston. To be so near Pollyanna and yet so far from her, he had found to be nothing but torture. In Boston, with all the feverishness of a restless mind that seeks distraction from itself, he had thrown himself into the carrying out of Mrs. Carew's plans for her beloved working girls, and such time as could be spared from his own duties he had devoted to this work, much to Mrs. Carew's delight and gratitude. And so for Jimmy the winter had passed and spring had come, a joyous, blossoming spring full of soft breezes, gentle showers, and tender green buds expanding into riotous bloom and fragrance. To Jimmy, however, it was anything but a joyous spring, for in his heart was still nothing but a gloomy winter of discontent.
If only they'd settle things and announce the engagement once for all,
murmured Jimmy to himself more and more frequently these days.
If only I could know something for sure, I think I could stand it better.
Then, one day late in April, he had his wish. A part of it, he learned something for sure. It was 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and Mary, at Mrs. Carew's, had ushered him into the music room with a well-trained,
"I'll tell Mrs. Carew you're here, sir. She's expecting you, I think."
In the music room, Jimmy had found himself brought to a dismayed halt by the sight of Jamie at the piano, his arms outflung on the rack and his head bowed upon them. Pendleton had half turned to beat a soft retreat when the man at the piano lifted his head, bringing into view 2 flushed cheeks and a pair of fever-bright eyes.
"Why, Carew,"
stammered Pendleton, aghast.
"Has anything, happened?"
Happened?
Ejaculated the lame youth, flinging out both his hands, in each of which, as Pendleton now saw, was an open letter.
Everything has happened. Wouldn't you think it had, if all your life you'd been in prison, and suddenly you saw the gates flung wide open? Wouldn't you think it had, if all in a minute you could ask the girl you loved to be your wife? Wouldn't you think it had, if... But listen, you think I'm crazy, but I'm not. Though maybe I am, after all, crazy with joy. I'd like to tell you. May I? I've got to tell somebody.
Pendleton lifted his head. It was as if, unconsciously, he was bracing himself for a blow. He had grown a little white, but his voice was quite steady when he answered,
"Sure you may, old fellow. I'd be glad to hear it."
Carew, however, had scarcely waited for assent. He was rushing on, still a bit incoherently.
It's not much to you, of course. You have 2 feet and your freedom. You have your ambitions and your bridges. But to me, it's everything. It's a chance to live a man's life and do a man's work, perhaps. Even if it isn't dams and bridges, it's something. And it's something I've proved now I can do. Listen, in that letter, there is the announcement that a little story of mine has won the first prize, $3,000 in a contest. In that other letter there, a big publishing house accepts with flattering enthusiasm my first book manuscript for publication. And they both came today, this morning. Do you wonder I am crazy glad?
No, indeed. I congratulate you, Carew, with all my heart,
cried Jimmy warmly.
Thank you, and you may congratulate me. Think what it means to me. Think what it means if by and by I can be independent like a man. Think what it means if I can someday make Mrs. Carew proud and glad that she gave the crippled lad a place in her home and heart. Think what it means for me to be able to tell the girl I love that I do love her.
Yes, indeed, old boy.
Jimmy spoke firmly, though he had grown very white now.
Of course, maybe I ought not to do that last, even now,
resumed Jamie, a swift cloud shadowing the shining brightness of his countenance.
I'm still tied to these.
He tapped the crutches by his side.
I can't forget, of course, that day in the woods last summer when I saw Pollyanna. I realized that I'll always have to run the chance of seeing the girl I love in danger and not being able to rescue her.
Oh, but Carew,
began the other huskily. Carew lifted a peremptory hand.
I know what you'd say, but don't say it. You can't understand. You aren't tied to 2 sticks. You did the rescuing, not I. It came to me then how it would be, always, with me and Sadie. I'd have to stand aside and see others.
Sadie?
Cut in Jimmy sharply.
Yes, Sadie Dean. You act surprised. Didn't you know? Haven't you suspected how I felt towards Sadie?
Cried Jamie.
Have I kept it so well to myself then? I tried to, but...
He finished with a faint smile and a half-despairing gesture.
Well, you certainly kept it all right, old fellow. From me, anyhow,
cried Jimmy gaily. The color had come back to Jimmy's face in a rich flood, and his eyes had grown suddenly very bright indeed.
So it's Sadie Dean. Good. I congratulate you again, I do, as Nancy says.
Jimmy was quite babbling with joy and excitement now. So great and wonderful had been the reaction within him at the discovery that it was Sadie, not Pollyanna, whom Jamie loved. Jamie flushed and shook his head a bit sadly.
No congratulations yet. You see, I haven't spoken to her, but I think she must know. I suppose everybody knew. Pray, whom did you think it was, if not Sadie?
Jimmy hesitated. Then, a little precipitately, he let it out.
Why, I'd thought of Pollyanna.
Jamie smiled and pursed his lips.
Pollyanna's a charming girl, and I love her, but not that way, any more than she does me. Besides, I fancy somebody else would have something to say about that, eh?
Jimmy colored like a happy, conscious boy.
Do you?
He challenged, trying to make his voice properly impersonal.
Of course. John Pendleton.
John Pendleton?
Jimmy wheeled sharply.
What about John Pendleton?
Queried a new voice, and Mrs. Carew came forward with a smile. Jimmy, around whose ears for the second time within 5 minutes the world had crashed into fragments, barely collected himself enough for a low word of greeting. But Jamie, unabashed, turned with a triumphant air of assurance.
Nothing? I only just said that I believed John Pendleton would have something to say about Pollyanna's loving anybody but him.
Pollyanna, John Pendleton.
Mrs. Carew sat down suddenly in the chair nearest her. If the two men before her had not been so deeply absorbed in their own affairs, they might have noticed that the smile had vanished from Mrs. Carew's lips and that an odd look of almost fear had come to her eyes.
Certainly,
maintained Jamie.
Were you both blind last summer? Wasn't he with her a lot?
Why, I thought he was with all of us,
murmured Mrs. Carew a little faintly.
Not as he was with Pollyanna,
insisted Jamie.
Besides, have you forgotten that day when we were talking about John Pendleton's marrying? Pollyanna blushed and stammered and said finally that he had thought of marrying once. Well, I wondered then if it wasn't something between them. Don't you remember?
Yes, I think I do, now that you speak of it,
murmured Mrs. Carew again.
But I had forgotten it.
Oh, but I can explain that,
cut in Jimmy, wetting his dry lips.
John Pendleton did have a love affair once, but it was with Pollyanna's mother.
Pollyanna's mother?
Exclaimed the two voices in surprise.
Yes, he loved her years ago, but she did not care for him at all, I understand. She had another lover, a minister, and she married him instead, Pollyanna's father.
Oh,
breathed Mrs. Carew, leaning forward suddenly in her chair.
And is that why he's never married?
Yes,
avouched Jimmy.
So you see, there's really nothing to that idea at all, that he cares for Pollyanna. It was her mother.
On the contrary, I think it makes a whole lot to that idea,
declared Jamie, wagging his head wisely.
I think it makes my case all the stronger. Listen, he once loved the mother, he couldn't have her. What more absolutely natural than that he should love the daughter now and win her?
Oh, Jamie, you incorrigible spinner of tales,
reproached Mrs. Carew with a nervous laugh.
This is no tenpenny novel, it's real life. She's too young for him. He ought to marry a woman, not a girl, that is. If he marries anyone, I mean.
She stammeringly corrected, a sudden flood of color in her face.
Perhaps, but what if it happens to be a girl that he loves?
Argued Jamie stubbornly.
And really, just stop to think. Have we had a single letter from her that hasn't told of his being there? And you know how he's always talking of Pollyanna in his letters.
Mrs. Carew got suddenly to her feet.
Yes, I know,
she murmured with an odd gesture, as if throwing something distasteful aside.
But...
She did not finish her sentence, and a moment later she had left the room. When she came back in 5 minutes, she found, much to her surprise, that Jimmy had gone.
Why, I thought he was going with us on the girls' picnic,
she exclaimed.
So did I,
frowned Jamie.
But the first thing I knew, he was explaining or apologizing or something about unexpectedly having to leave town, and he'd come to tell you he couldn't go with us. Anyhow, the next thing I knew, he'd gone. You see...
Jamie's eyes were glowing again.
I don't think I knew quite what he did say anyway. I had something else to think of.
And he jubilantly spread before her the 2 letters which all the time he had still kept in his hands.
Oh, Jamie!
breathed Mrs. Carew when she had read the letters through.
How proud I am of you!
Then suddenly her eyes filled with tears at the look of ineffable joy that illumined Jamie's face. End of Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jimmy and John. It was a very determined, square-jawed young man that alighted at the Beldingsville station late that Saturday night. And it was an even more determined, square-jawed young man that, before 10 o'clock the next morning, stalked through the Sunday quiet village streets and climbed the hill to the Harrington homestead. Catching sight of a loved and familiar flaxen coil of hair on a well-poised little head just disappearing into the summer house, the young man ignored the conventional front steps and doorbell, crossed the lawn, and strode through the garden paths until he came face to face with the owner of the flaxen coil of hair.
Jimmy!
Gasped Pollyanna, falling back with startled eyes.
Why, where did you come from?
Boston. Last night. I had to see you, Pollyanna.
To see... me?
Pollyanna was plainly fencing for time to regain her composure. Jimmy looked so big and strong and dear there in the door of the summer house that she feared her eyes had been surprised into a telltale admiration, if not more.
Yes, Pollyanna, I wanted... That is, I thought. I feared. Oh, hang it all. Pollyanna, I can't beat around the bush like this. I'll have to come straight to the point. It's just this. I stood aside before, but I won't now. It isn't a case any longer of fairness. He isn't crippled like Jamie. He's got feet and hands and a head like mine. And if he wins, he'll have to win in a fair fight. I've got some rights.
Pollyanna stared frankly.
Jimmy Bean Pendleton, whatever in the world are you talking about?
She demanded. The young man laughed shamefacedly.
No wonder you don't know. It wasn't very lucid, was it? But I don't think I've been really lucid myself since yesterday, when I found out from Jamie himself.
Found out? From Jamie?
Yes, it was the prize that started it. You see, he just got one, and...
Oh, I know about that.
Interrupted Pollyanna eagerly.
And wasn't it splendid? Just think, the first one, $3,000. I wrote him a letter last night. Why, when I saw his name and realized it was Jamie, our Jamie, I was so excited I forgot all about looking for my name. And even when I couldn't find mine at all and knew that I hadn't got any, I was so excited and pleased for Jamie that I forgot everything else.
Corrected Pollyanna, throwing a dismayed glance into Jimmy's face and feverishly trying to cover up the partial admission she had made. Jimmy, however, was too intent on his own problem to notice hers.
Yes, 'twas fine, of course. I'm glad he got it. But, Pollyanna, it was what he said afterward that I mean. You see, until then I'd thought that he cared, that you cared, for each other, and...
You thought that Jamie and I cared for each other,
exclaimed Pollyanna, into whose face now was stealing a soft, shy color.
Why, Jimmy, it's Sadie Dean. 'Twas always Sadie Dean. He used to talk of her to me by the hour. I think she likes him too.
Good. I hope she does. But you see, I didn't know. I thought 'twas Jamie and you. And I thought that because he was a cripple, you know, that it wouldn't be fair if I stayed around and tried to win you myself.
Pollyanna stooped suddenly and picked up a leaf at her feet. When she rose, her face was turned quite away.
A fellow can't feel square, you know, running a race with a chap that's handicapped from the start. So I just stayed away and gave him his chance. Though it most broke my heart to do it, little girl. It just did. Then yesterday morning I found out. But I found out something else, too. Jamie says there is somebody else in the case. But I can't stand aside for him, Pollyanna. I can't. Even in spite of all he's done for me. John Pendleton is a man, and he's got 2 whole feet for the race. He's got to take his chances. If you care for him, if you really care for him...
But Pollyanna had turned, wild-eyed.
John Pendleton? Jimmy, what do you mean? What are you saying about John Pendleton?
A great joy transfigured Jimmy's face. He held out both his hands.
Then you don't? You don't. I can see it in your eyes that you don't care.
Pollyanna shrank back. She was white and trembling.
Jimmy, what do you mean? What do you mean?
She begged piteously.
I mean, you don't care for Uncle John. That way. Don't you understand? Jamie thinks you do care, and that, anyway, he cares for you. And then I began to see it, that maybe he did. He's always talking about you, and, of course, there was your mother.
Pollyanna gave a low moan and covered her face with her hands. Jimmy came close and laid a caressing arm about her shoulders, but again Pollyanna shrank from him.
Pollyanna, little girl, don't. You'll break my heart.
He begged.
Don't you care for me any? Is it that, and you don't want to tell me?
She dropped her hands and faced him. Her eyes had the hunted look of some wild thing at bay.
Jimmy, do you think he cares for me that way?
She entreated just above a whisper. Jimmy gave his head an impatient shake.
Never mind that, Pollyanna. Now. I don't know, of course. How should I? But, dearest, that isn't the question. It's you. If you don't care for him, and if you'll only give me a chance, half a chance, to let me make you care for me.
He caught her hand and tried to draw her to him.
No, Jimmy. I mustn't. I can't.
With both her little palms, she pushed him from her.
Pollyanna, you don't mean you do care for him?
Jimmy's face whitened.
No, indeed. Not that way.
Faltered Pollyanna.
But don't you see? If he cares for me, I'll have to learn to, some way.
Pollyanna!
Don't look at me like that, Jimmy.
You mean you'd marry him, Pollyanna?
Oh, no. I mean, why, yes, I suppose so.
She admitted faintly.
Pollyanna, you wouldn't. You couldn't. Pollyanna, you're breaking my heart.
Pollyanna gave a low sob. Her face was in her hands again. For a moment, she sobbed on, chokingly. Then, with a tragic gesture, she lifted her head and looked straight into Jimmy's anguished, reproachful eyes.
I know it.
She chattered frenziedly.
I'm breaking mine, too. But I'll have to do it. I'd break your heart. I'd break mine. But I'd never break his.
Jimmy raised his head. His eyes flashed a sudden fire. His whole appearance underwent a swift and marvelous change. With a tender, triumphant cry, he swept Pollyanna into his arms and held her close.
Now I know you care for me.
He breathed low in her ear.
You said it was breaking your heart, too. Do you think I'll give you up now to any man on earth? Ah, dear, you little understand a love like mine if you think I'd give you up now. Pollyanna, say you love me. Say it with your own dear lips.
For one long minute, Pollyanna lay unresisting in the fiercely tender embrace that encircled her. Then, with a sigh that was half content, half renunciation, she began to draw herself away.
Yes, Jimmy, I do love you.
Jimmy's arms tightened and would have drawn her back to him, but something in the girl's face forbade.
I love you dearly, but I couldn't ever be happy with you and feel that. Jimmy, don't you see, dear? I'll have to know that I'm free first.
Nonsense, Pollyanna. Of course you're free.
Jimmy's eyes were mutinous again. Pollyanna shook her head.
Not with this hanging over me, Jimmy. Don't you see? It was Mother long ago that broke his heart. My mother. And all these years he's lived a lonely, unloved life in consequence. If now he should come to me and ask me to make that up to him, I'd have to do it, Jimmy. I'd have to. I couldn't refuse. Don't you see?
But Jimmy did not see. He could not see. He would not see, though Pollyanna pleaded and argued long and tearfully. But Pollyanna, too, was obdurate, though so sweetly and heartbreakingly obdurate that Jimmy, in spite of his pain and anger, felt almost like turning comforter.
Jimmy, dear,
said Pollyanna at last.
We'll have to wait, and that's all I can say now. I hope he doesn't care, and I don't believe he does care, but I've got to know. I've got to be sure. We'll just have to wait, a little, till we find out. Jimmy, till we find out.
And to this plan Jimmy had to submit, though it was with a most rebellious heart.
All right, little girl. It'll have to be as you say, of course.
He despaired.
But surely, never before was a man kept waiting for his answer till the girl he loved, and who loved him, found out if the other man wanted her.
I know. But you see, dear, never before had the other man wanted her mother.
Sighed Pollyanna, her face puckered into an anxious frown.
Very well. I'll go back to Boston, of course.
Acceded Jimmy reluctantly.
But you needn't think I've given up, because I haven't. Nor I shan't give up, just so long as I know you really care for me, my little sweetheart.
He finished with a look that sent her palpitatingly into retreat, just out of reach of his arms. End of Chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Pendleton turns the key. Jimmy went back to Boston that night in a state that was a most tantalizing commingling of happiness, hope, exasperation, and rebellion. Behind him, he left a girl who was in a scarcely less enviable frame of mind, for Pollyanna, tremulously happy in the wondrous thought of Jimmy's love for her, was yet so despairingly terrified at the thought of the possible love of John Pendleton that there was not a thrill of joy that did not carry its pang of fear. Fortunately for all concerned, however, this state of affairs was not of long duration, for, as it chanced, John Pendleton, in whose unwitting hands lay the key to the situation, in less than a week after Jimmy's hurried visit, turned that key in the lock and opened the door of doubt. It was late Thursday afternoon that John Pendleton called to see Pollyanna. As it happened, he, like Jimmy, saw Pollyanna in the garden and came straight toward her. Pollyanna, looking into his face, felt a sudden sinking of the heart.
It's come. It's come.
She shivered, and involuntarily she turned as if to flee.
Oh, Pollyanna, wait a minute, please,
called the man, hastening his steps.
You're just the one I wanted to see. Come, can't we go in here?
He suggested, turning toward the summer house.
I want to speak to you about, something.
Why, yes, of course,
stammered Pollyanna with forced gaiety. Pollyanna knew that she was blushing, and she particularly wished not to blush just then. It did not help matters any either that he should have elected to go into the summer house for his talk. The summer house now, to Pollyanna, was sacred to certain dear memories of Jimmy.
And to think it should be here. Here.
She was shuddering frantically, but aloud she said, still gaily,
It's a lovely evening, isn't it?
There was no answer. John Pendleton strode into the summer house and dropped himself into a rustic chair without even waiting for Pollyanna to seat herself, a most unusual proceeding on the part of John Pendleton. Pollyanna, stealing a nervous glance at his face, found it so startlingly like the old stern, sour visage of her childhood's remembrance that she uttered an involuntary exclamation. Still, John Pendleton paid no heed. Still moodily he sat, wrapped in thought. At last, however, he lifted his head and gazed somberly into Pollyanna's startled eyes.
Pollyanna?
Yes, Mr. Pendleton?
Do you remember the sort of man I was when you first knew me years ago?
Why, yes, I think so.
Delightfully agreeable specimen of humanity, wasn't I?
In spite of her perturbation, Pollyanna smiled faintly.
I liked you, sir.
Not until the words were uttered did Pollyanna realize just how they would sound. She strove then frantically to recall or modify them and had almost added I liked you then, when she stopped just in time. Certainly that would not have helped matters any. She listened then, fearfully, for John Pendleton's next words. They came almost at once.
I know you did. Bless your little heart. And it was that was the saving of me. I wonder, Pollyanna, if I could ever make you realize just what your childish trust and liking did for me.
Pollyanna stammered a confused protest, but he brushed it smilingly aside.
Oh, yes, it was. It was you, and no one else. I wonder if you remember another thing, too,
resumed the man after a moment's silence, during which Pollyanna looked furtively but longingly toward the door.
I wonder if you remember my telling you once that nothing but a woman's hand and heart, or a child's presence, could make a home.
Pollyanna felt the blood rush to her face.
Yes. No. I mean, yes, I remember it.
She stuttered.
But I don't think it's always so now. I mean, that is, I'm sure your home now is lovely just as it is, and...
But it's my home I'm talking about, child,
interrupted the man impatiently.
Pollyanna, you know the kind of home I once hoped to have, and how those hopes were dashed to the ground. Don't think, dear, I'm blaming your mother. I'm not. She but obeyed her heart, which was right, and she made the wiser choice, anyway, as was proved by the dreary waste I've made of my life because of that disappointment. After all, Pollyanna, isn't it strange,
added John Pendleton, his voice growing tender,
that it should be the little hand of her own daughter that led me into the path of happiness at last?
Pollyanna moistened her lips convulsively.
Oh, but Mr. Pendleton, I...
Once again the man brushed aside her protests with a smiling gesture.
Yes, it was, Pollyanna. Your little hand in the long ago. You and your glad game.
Oh.
Pollyanna relaxed visibly in her seat. The terror in her eyes began slowly to recede.
And so all these years I've been gradually growing into a different man, Pollyanna. But there's one thing I haven't changed in, my dear.
He paused, looked away, then turned gravely tender eyes back to her face.
I still think it takes a woman's hand and heart, or a child's presence, to make a home.
Yes, but you've got the child's presence,
plunged in Pollyanna, the terror coming back to her eyes.
There's Jimmy, you know.
The man gave an amused laugh.
I know, but I don't think even you would say that Jimmy is exactly a child's presence any longer,
he remarked.
No, of course not.
Besides, Pollyanna, I've made up my mind. I've got to have the woman's hand and heart.
His voice dropped and trembled a little.
Oh, have you?
Pollyanna's fingers met and clutched each other in a spasmodic clasp. John Pendleton, however, seemed neither to hear nor see. He had leaped to his feet and was nervously pacing up and down the little house.
Pollyanna.
He stopped and faced her.
If you were I, and were going to ask the woman you love to come and make your old gray pile of stone a home, how would you go to work to do it?
Pollyanna half started from her chair. Her eyes sought the door, this time openly, longingly.
Oh, but Mr. Pendleton, I wouldn't do it at all, she
stammered a little wildly.
I'm sure you'd be much happier as you are.
The man stared in puzzled surprise, then laughed grimly.
Upon my word, Pollyanna, is it quite so bad as that?
He asked.
But bad?
Pollyanna had the appearance of being poised for flight.
Yes. Is that just your way of trying to soften the blow of saying that you don't think she'd have me anyway?
Oh, no, indeed. She'd say yes. She'd have to say yes, you know,
explained Pollyanna with terrified earnestness.
But I've been thinking. I was thinking that if the girl didn't love you, you really would be happier without her, and...
At the look that came into John Pendleton's face, Pollyanna stopped short.
I shouldn't want her if she didn't love me, Pollyanna.
No, I thought not too.
Pollyanna began to look a little less distracted.
Besides, she doesn't happen to be a girl,
went on John Pendleton.
She's a mature woman who, presumably, would know her own mind.
The man's voice was grave and slightly reproachful.
Oh!
Exclaimed Pollyanna, the dawning happiness in her eyes leaping forth in a flash of ineffable joy and relief.
Then you love somebody!
By an almost superhuman effort, Pollyanna choked off the else before it left her delighted lips.
Love somebody? Haven't I just been telling you I did?
Laughed John Pendleton, half vexedly.
What I want to know is, can she be made to love me? That's where I was sort of counting on your help, Pollyanna. You see, she's a dear friend of yours.
Is she?
Gurgled Pollyanna.
Then she'll just have to love you. We'll make her. Maybe she does anyway already. Who is she?
There was a long pause before the answer came.
I believe, after all, Pollyanna, I won't. Yes, I will, too. It's, can't you guess? Mrs. Carew.
Oh!
Breathed Pollyanna with a face of unclouded joy.
How perfectly lovely! I'm so glad. Glad.
A long hour later, Pollyanna sent Jimmy a letter. It was confused and incoherent, a series of half-completed, illogical, but shyly joyous sentences, out of which Jimmy gathered much. A little from what was written, more from what was left unwritten. After all, did he really need more than this?
Oh, Jimmy, he doesn't love me a bit. It's someone else. I mustn't tell you who it is, but her name isn't Pollyanna.
Jimmy had just time to catch the 7 o'clock train for Beldingsville, and he caught it. End of Chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. After long years. Pollyanna was so happy that night after she had sent her letter to Jimmy that she could not quite keep it to herself. Always before going to bed, she stepped into her aunt's room to see if anything were needed. Tonight, after the usual questions, she had turned to put out the light when a sudden impulse sent her back to her aunt's bedside. A little breathlessly, she dropped on her knees.
Aunt Polly, I'm so happy I just have to tell someone. I want to tell you. May I?
Tell me? Tell me what, child? Of course you may tell me. You mean it's good news? For me?
Why, yes, dear. I hope so.
Blushed Pollyanna.
I hope it will make you glad. A little for me, you know. Of course, Jimmy will tell you himself all properly someday, but I wanted to tell you first.
Jimmy?
Mrs. Chilton's face changed perceptibly.
Yes, when he asks you for me.
Stammered Pollyanna with a radiant flood of color.
Oh, I'm so happy I had to tell you.
Asks me for you? Pollyanna!
Mrs. Chilton pulled herself up in bed.
You don't mean to say there's anything serious between you and Jimmy Bean?
Pollyanna fell back in dismay.
Why, Auntie, I thought you liked Jimmy.
So I do, in his place. But that place isn't the husband of my niece.
Aunt Polly!
Come, child, don't look so shocked. This is all sheer nonsense, and I'm glad I've been able to stop it before it's gone any further.
But Aunt Polly, it has gone further.
Quavered Pollyanna.
Why, I've already learned to care for him dearly.
Then you'll have to unlearn it, Pollyanna, for never will I give my consent to your marrying Jimmy Bean.
But why, Auntie?
First and foremost, because we know nothing about him.
Why, Aunt Polly, we've always known him, ever since I was a little girl.
Yes. And what was he? A rough little runaway urchin from an orphan's home. We know nothing whatever about his people and his pedigree.
But I'm not marrying his people and his pedigree.
With an impatient groan, Aunt Polly fell back on her pillow.
Pollyanna, you are making me positively ill. My heart is going like a trip hammer. I shan't sleep a wink tonight. Can't you let this thing rest till morning?
Pollyanna was on her feet instantly, her face all contrition.
Why, yes, indeed, of course, Aunt Polly. And tomorrow you'll feel different. I'm sure you will.
Reiterated the girl, her voice quivering with hope again as she turned to extinguish the light. But Aunt Polly did not feel different in the morning. If anything, her opposition to the marriage was even more determined. In vain Pollyanna pleaded and argued. In vain she showed how deeply her happiness was concerned. Aunt Polly was obdurate. She would have none of the idea. She sternly admonished Pollyanna as to the possible evils of heredity and warned her of the dangers of marrying into she knew not what sort of family. She even appealed at last to her sense of duty and gratitude toward herself and reminded Pollyanna of the long years of loving care that had been hers in the home of her aunt, and she begged her piteously not to break her heart by this marriage as had her mother years before by her marriage. When Jimmy himself, radiant-faced and glowing-eyed, came at 10 o'clock, he was met by a frightened, sob-shaken little Pollyanna that tried ineffectually to hold him back with two trembling hands. With whitening cheeks, but with defiantly tender arms that held her close, he demanded an explanation.
Pollyanna, dearest, what in the world is the meaning of this?
Oh, Jimmy. Jimmy, why did you come? Why did you come? I was going to write and tell you straight away,
moaned Pollyanna.
But you did write me, dear. I got it yesterday afternoon, just in time to catch my train.
No. Again, I mean. I didn't know then that I couldn't.
Couldn't? Pollyanna!
His eyes flamed into stern wrath.
You don't mean to tell me there's anybody else's love you think you've got to keep me waiting for?
He demanded, holding her at arm's length.
No, Jimmy. Don't look at me like that. I can't bear it.
Then what is it? What is it you can't do?
I can't marry you.
Pollyanna, do you love me?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Then you shall marry me,
triumphed Jimmy, his arms enfolding her again.
No, Jimmy, you don't understand. It's Aunt Polly,
struggled Pollyanna.
Aunt Polly?
Yes, she won't let me.
Oh.
Jimmy tossed his head with a light laugh.
We'll fix Aunt Polly. She thinks she's going to lose you, but we'll just remind her that she's going to gain a new nephew.
He finished in mock importance, but Pollyanna did not smile. She turned her head hopelessly from side to side.
No, Jimmy, you don't understand. Oh, how can I tell you? She objects to you for me.
Jimmy's arms relaxed a little. His eyes sobered.
Oh, well, I suppose I can't blame her for that. I'm no wonder, of course,
he admitted constrainedly.
Still,
he turned loving eyes upon her.
I'd try to make you happy, dear.
Indeed you would. I know you would,
protested Pollyanna tearfully.
Then why not give me a chance to try, Pollyanna? Even if she doesn't quite approve at first. Maybe in time, after we were married, we could win her over.
Oh, but I couldn't. I couldn't do that,
moaned Pollyanna.
After what she said, I couldn't without her consent. You see, she's done so much for me, and she's so dependent on me. She isn't well a bit now, Jimmy. And really, lately she's been so loving. And she's been trying so hard to play the game, you know, in spite of all her troubles. And she cried, Jimmy, and begged me not to break her heart as Mother did long ago. And Jimmy, I just couldn't after all she's done for me.
There was a moment's pause. Then, with a vivid red mounting to her forehead, Pollyanna spoke again, brokenly.
Jimmy, if you could only tell Aunt Polly something about your father and your people and...
Jimmy's arms dropped suddenly. He stepped back a little. The color drained from his face.
Is that it?
He asked.
Yes.
Pollyanna came nearer and touched his arm timidly.
Don't think it isn't for me, Jimmy. I don't care. Besides, I know that your father and your people were all fine and noble because you are so fine and noble. But she? Jimmy, don't look at me like that.
But Jimmy, with a low moan, had turned quite away from her. A minute later, with only a few choking words which she could not understand, he had left the house. From the Harrington homestead, Jimmy went straight home and sought out John Pendleton. He found him in the great crimson-hung library where, some years before, Pollyanna had looked fearfully about for the skeleton in John Pendleton's closet.
"Uncle John, do you remember that packet Father gave me?"
demanded Jimmy.
Why, yes. What's the matter, son?
John Pendleton had given a start of surprise at the sight of Jimmy's face.
"That packet has got to be opened, sir."
But the conditions.
"I can't help it. It's got to be. That's all. Will you do it?"
Why, yes, my boy, of course, if you insist, but...
He paused helplessly.
"Uncle John, as perhaps you have guessed, I love Pollyanna. I asked her to be my wife, and she consented."
The elder man made a delighted exclamation, but the other did not pause or change his sternly intent expression.
"She says now she can't marry me. Mrs. Chilton objects. She objects to me."
Objects to you?
John Pendleton's eyes flashed angrily.
"Yes. I found out why when Pollyanna begged if I couldn't tell her aunt something about my father and my people."
Shucks, I thought Polly Chilton had more sense. Still, it's just like her, after all. The Harringtons have always been inordinately proud of race and family.
Snapped John Pendleton.
Well, could you?
"Could I? It was on the end of my tongue to tell Pollyanna that there couldn't have been a better father than mine was. Then, suddenly, I remembered. The packet, and what it said. And I was afraid. I didn't dare say a word till I knew what was inside that packet. There's something Dad didn't want me to know till I was 30 years old, when I would be a man grown, and could stand anything. See? There's a secret somewhere in our lives, and I've got to know that secret, and I've got to know it now."
But, Jimmy, lad, don't look so tragic. It may be a good secret. Perhaps it'll be something you'll like to know.
"Perhaps. But if it had been, would he have been apt to keep it from me till I was 30 years old? No. Uncle John, it was something he was trying to save me from till I was old enough to stand it and not flinch. Understand, I'm not blaming Dad. Whatever it was something he couldn't help, I'll warrant. But what it was, I've got to know. Will you get it, please? It's in your safe, you know."
John Pendleton rose at once.
I'll get it,
he said. 3 minutes later, it lay in Jimmy's hand, but Jimmy held it out at once.
"I would rather you read it, sir, please. Then tell me."
But, Jimmy, Very well.
With a decisive gesture, John Pendleton picked up a paper cutter, opened the envelope, and pulled out the contents. There was a package of several papers tied together, and one folded sheet alone, apparently a letter. This John Pendleton opened and read first, and as he read, Jimmy, tense and breathless, watched his face. He saw, therefore, the look of amazement, joy, and something else he could not name that leaped into John Pendleton's countenance.
"Uncle John, what is it? What is it?"
he demanded.
"Read it for yourself,"
answered the man, thrusting the letter into Jimmy's outstretched hand, and Jimmy read this.
"The enclosed papers are the legal proof that my boy, Jimmy, is really James Kent, son of John Kent, who married Dolores Wetherby, daughter of William Wetherby of Boston. There is also a letter in which I explain to my boy why I have kept him from his mother's family all these years. If this packet is opened by him at 30 years of age, he will read this letter, and hope will forgive a father who feared to lose his boy entirely, so took this drastic course to keep him to himself. If it is opened by strangers, because of his death, I request that his mother's people in Boston be notified at once, and the enclosed package of papers be given, intact, into their hands. John Kent."
Jimmy was pale and shaken when he looked up to meet John Pendleton's eyes.
"Am I the lost Jamie?
He faltered.
The letter says you have documents there to prove it.
Nodded the other.
Mrs. Carew's nephew?
Of course.
But why? What? I can't realize it.
There was a moment's pause before into Jimmy's face flashed a new joy.
Then surely now I know who I am. I can tell Mrs. Chilton something of my people.
I should say you could,
retorted John Pendleton dryly.
The Boston Wetherbys can trace straight back to the Crusades, and I don't know but to the year 1. That ought to satisfy her. As for your father, he came of good stock, too, Mrs. Carew told me, though he was rather eccentric and not pleasing to the family, as you know, of course.
Yes, poor Dad. And what a life he must have lived with me all those years, always dreading pursuit. I can understand lots of things now that used to puzzle me. A woman called me Jamie once. Jove, how angry he was. I know now why he hurried me away that night without even waiting for supper. Poor Dad. It was right after that he was taken sick. He couldn't use his hands or his feet, and very soon he couldn't talk straight. Something ailed his speech. I remember when he died, he was trying to tell me something about this packet. I believe now he was telling me to open it and go to my mother's people. But I thought then he was just telling me to keep it safe. So that's what I promised him. But it didn't comfort him any. It only seemed to worry him more. You see, I didn't understand. Poor Dad.
Suppose we take a look at these papers,
suggested John Pendleton.
Besides, there's a letter from your father to you, I understand. Don't you want to read it?
Yes, of course. And then...
The young fellow laughed shamefacedly and glanced at the clock.
I was wondering just how soon I could go back to Pollyanna.
A thoughtful frown came to John Pendleton's face. He glanced at Jimmy, hesitated, then spoke.
I know you want to see Pollyanna, lad, and I don't blame you. But it strikes me that, under the circumstances, you should go first to Mrs. Carew, and take these.
He tapped the papers before him. Jimmy drew his brows together and pondered.
All right, sir. I will.
He agreed resignedly.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to go with you,
further suggested John Pendleton, a little diffidently.
I have a little matter of my own that I'd like to see your aunt about. Suppose we go down today on the 3 o'clock.
Good. We will, sir. Gory, and so I'm Jamie. I can't grasp it yet,
exclaimed the young man, springing to his feet and restlessly moving about the room.
I wonder now.
He stopped and colored boyishly.
Do you think Aunt Ruth will mind very much?
John Pendleton shook his head. A hint of the old somberness came into his eyes.
Hardly, my boy, but I'm thinking of myself. What about it? When you're her boy, where am I coming in?
You? Do you think anything could put you one side?
Scoffed Jimmy fervently.
You needn't worry about that. And she won't mind. She has Jamie, you know, and...
He stopped short, a dawning dismay in his eyes.
By George! Uncle John, I forgot Jamie. This is going to be tough on Jamie.
Yes, I'd thought of that. Still, he's legally adopted, isn't he?
Oh, yes, it isn't that. It's the fact that he isn't the real Jamie himself. And he with his 2 poor useless legs. Why, Uncle John, it'll just about kill him. I've heard him talk. I know. Besides, Pollyanna and Mrs. Carew both have told me how he feels, how sure he is, and how happy he is. Great Scott, I can't take away from him this. But what can I do?
I don't know, my boy. I don't see as there's anything you can do but what you are doing.
There was a long silence. Jimmy had resumed his nervous pacing up and down the room. Suddenly he wheeled, his face alight.
There is a way, and I'll do it. I know Mrs. Carew will agree. We won't tell. We won't tell anybody but Mrs. Carew herself, and Pollyanna, and her aunt. I'll have to tell them,"
he added defensively.
You certainly will, my boy. As for the rest...
John Pendleton paused doubtfully.
"It's nobody's business."
But remember, you are making quite a sacrifice in several ways. I want you to weigh it well.
Weigh it? I have weighed it, and there's nothing in it. With Jamie on the other side of the scales, sir. I just couldn't do it. That's all.
I don't blame you, and I think you're right,
declared John Pendleton heartily.
Furthermore, I believe Mrs. Carew will agree with you, particularly as she'll know now that the real Jamie is found at last.
You know she's always said she'd seen me somewhere,
chuckled Jimmy.
Now how soon does that train go? I'm ready.
Well, I'm not,
laughed John Pendleton.
Luckily for me, it doesn't go for some hours yet, anyhow,
he finished as he got to his feet and left the room. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A New Aladdin. Whatever were John Pendleton's preparations for departure, and they were both varied and hurried, they were done in the open, with two exceptions. The exceptions were two letters, one addressed to Pollyanna and one to Mrs. Polly Chilton. These letters, together with careful and minute instructions, were given into the hands of Susan, his housekeeper, to be delivered after they should be gone. But of all this, Jimmy knew nothing. The travelers were nearing Boston when John Pendleton said to Jimmy,
My boy, I've got one favor to ask, or rather two. The first is that we say nothing to Mrs. Carew until tomorrow afternoon. The other is that you allow me to go first and be your, ambassador, you yourself not appearing on the scene until perhaps, say, 4 o'clock. Are you willing?
Indeed I am,
replied Jimmy promptly.
Not only willing, but delighted. I'd been wondering how I was going to break the ice, and I'm glad to have somebody else to do it.
Good. Then I'll try to get your aunt on the telephone tomorrow morning and make my appointment.
True to his promise, Jimmy did not appear at the Carew mansion until 4 o'clock the next afternoon. Even then, he felt suddenly so embarrassed that he walked twice by the house before he summoned sufficient courage to go up the steps and ring the bell. Once in Mrs. Carew's presence, however, he was soon his natural self. So quickly did she set him at his ease, and so tactfully did she handle the situation. To be sure, at the very first, there were a few tears and a few incoherent exclamations. Even John Pendleton had to reach a hasty hand for his handkerchief. But before very long, a semblance of normal tranquility was restored, and only the tender glow in Mrs. Carew's eyes and the ecstatic happiness in Jimmy's and John Pendleton's was left to mark the occasion as something out of the ordinary.
And I think it's so fine of you about Jamie,
exclaimed Mrs. Carew after a little.
Indeed, Jimmy. I shall still call you Jimmy, for obvious reasons. Besides, I like it better for you. Indeed, I think you're just right if you're willing to do it. And I'm making some sacrifice myself, too.
She went on tearfully.
For I should be so proud to introduce you to the world as my nephew.
And indeed, Aunt Ruth,
At a half-stifled exclamation from John Pendleton, Jimmy stopped short. He saw then that Jamie and Sadie Dean stood just inside the door. Jamie's face was very white.
Aunt Ruth!
He exclaimed, looking from one to the other with startled eyes.
Aunt Ruth, you don't mean...
All the blood receded from Mrs. Carew's face, and from Jimmy's, too. John Pendleton, however, advanced, jauntily.
Yes, Jamie, why not? I was going to tell you soon, anyway, so I'll tell you now.
Jimmy gasped and stepped hastily forward, but John Pendleton silenced him with a look.
Just a little while ago, Mrs. Carew made me the happiest of men by saying yes to a certain question I asked. Now, as Jimmy calls me Uncle John, why shouldn't he begin right away to call Mrs. Carew Aunt Ruth?
Oh ha!
Exclaimed Jamie in plain delight, while Jimmy, under John Pendleton's steady gaze, just managed to save the situation by not blurting out his surprise and pleasure. Naturally, too, just then, blushing Mrs. Carew became the center of everyone's interest, and the danger point was passed. Only Jimmy heard John Pendleton say low in his ear a bit later,
"So you see, you young rascal, I'm not going to lose you, after all. We shall both have you now."
Exclamations and congratulations were still at their height when Jamie, a new light in his eyes, turned without warning to Sadie Dean.
Sadie, I'm going to tell them now,
he declared triumphantly. Then, with the bright color in Sadie's face telling the tender story even before Jamie's eager lips could frame the words, more congratulations and exclamations were in order, and everybody was laughing and shaking hands with everybody else. Jimmy, however, very soon began to eye them all aggrievedly, longingly.
"This is all very well for you,"
he complained then.
"You each have each other. But where do I come in? I can just tell you, though, that if only a certain young lady I know were here, I should have something to tell you, perhaps."
"Just a minute, Jimmy,"
interposed John Pendleton.
"Let's play I was Aladdin, and let me rub the lamp. Mrs. Carew, have I your permission to ring for Mary?"
Why, yes, certainly,
murmured the lady in a puzzled surprise that found its duplicate on the faces of the others. A few moments later, Mary stood in the doorway.
"Did I hear Miss Pollyanna come in a short time ago?"
asked John Pendleton.
Yes, sir, she is here.
"Won't you ask her to come down, please?"
"Pollyanna here!"
exclaimed an amazed chorus as Mary disappeared. Jimmy turned very white, then very red.
"Yes. I sent a note to her yesterday by my housekeeper. I took the liberty of asking her down for a few days to see you, Mrs. Carew. I thought the little girl needed a rest and a holiday, and my housekeeper has instructions to remain and care for Mrs. Chilton. I also wrote a note to Mrs. Chilton herself,"
he added, turning suddenly to Jimmy with unmistakable meaning in his eyes.
"and I thought after she read what I said that she'd let Pollyanna come. It seems she did, for here she is."
And there she was in the doorway, blushing, starry-eyed, yet withal just a bit shy and questioning.
"Pollyanna, dearest."
It was Jimmy who sprang forward to meet her, and who, without 1 minute's hesitation, took her in his arms and kissed her.
"Oh, Jimmy, before all these people,"
breathed Pollyanna in embarrassed protest.
"Pooh! I should have kissed you then, Pollyanna, if you'd been straight in the middle of Washington Street itself,"
vowed Jimmy.
"For that matter, look at all these people and see for yourself if you need to worry about them."
And Pollyanna looked, and she saw. Over by one window, backs carefully turned, Jamie and Sadie Dean. Over by another window, backs also carefully turned, Mrs. Carew and John Pendleton. Pollyanna smiled so adorably that Jimmy kissed her again.
"Oh, Jimmy, isn't it all beautiful and wonderful?"
she murmured softly.
"And Aunt Polly, she knows everything now, and it's all right. I think it would have been all right anyway. She was beginning to feel so bad for me. Now she's so glad, and I am too. Why, Jimmy, I'm glad for everything now."
Jimmy caught his breath with a joy that hurt.
"God grant, little girl, that always it may be so, with you."
He choked unsteadily, his arms holding her close.
"I'm sure it will,"
sighed Pollyanna with shining eyes of confidence. End of chapter 32. End of Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter.